Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel, thank you for being here today once again.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. It's good to be with
good.
you.
We want to talk a little bit about why we're spending so much money on foreign policy and whether or not it's doing any good. But there's been a couple recent articles talking about foreign intervention for humanitarian reasons and foreign intervention for military reasons. And our friend Andrew Basovich mentions that, a lot of the problem lies with the Congress, that they just allow the presidents to do everything, and they are out of control, and we've complained about that a lot. But then again, isn't it true that the Congress has the power of the purse? So they're there. Actually, it's been used in a legal argument that once the Congress finances a war, they more or less endorse the war and indirectly declare the war or give the president the authority, and that's obviously the case. But this is something that we've talked about a lot, and it's getting very, very expensive. It's very deceptive. There has to be powerful forces, behind what's going on. And even those in the presidential campaign today that come from the far left to call themselves progressives and are anti-war, they're not all that pure either. I mean, you can't say just because they come from the far left they're going to cut things down. But this is getting out of hand. It's a lot worse. And I think the most serious part is what Basovich points out, is that the way we go to war and the permission that is sort of given to the executive branch and what the executive branch have done, including getting authority from international bodies. I think this is a serious matter. So what's the easy solution? What are we going to do about this?
Follow the Constitution.
Yeah,
but what Vasevich points out I think Congress perpetuates a willful misunderstanding of the role of the president in times of war. How many times do you hear them say the president is the commander-in-chief? The president is the commander-in-chief, but they fail to point out to the American people that Congress is the authorizing body. The president is not the commander-in-chief until there's a declaration of war. So I think they purposely conflate that because they don't want to take responsibility for these wars. And you alluded to it a second ago, and I'll be even more specific. Someone like Bernie Sanders, who's certainly better than most when it comes to war, and he has opposed wars in the past like Iraq. But Congress doesn't like to go on record opposing or supporting wars, but once the war is started, they'll vote for the money. He wasn't happy about the Libya war, but he voted for many aspects of it. So this is how they get around it.
Well, do you think there are any military plants in Vermont? Maybe there's a little bit of influence there. I think they build weapons in almost every state. Everybody has an interest in the military because the voters will complain, even though some of that is actually detrimental in the long run. But I think that would be part of the motivation. But, there's another interesting question that comes up in reading these couple articles, and that is, what is the moral responsibility you have? Sometimes it's been thrown out to me by people interviewing me and say, you mean you just want to be non-interventionist? That means if they're overrunning the Hutus in Africa, that you just stand by. And of course, there's a lot of, the answer is stand by. But they will put it in moral terms. Morality, I was saying that we have to be intervened. But what about the extension of this? What if we first are their friends and we give them money, then we turn on them, and then we give them bombs, and then we destroy the infrastructure? I think we've done that in a few countries. The most recent one, which was a total disaster, is Iraq. But our money keeps flowing in there. So what do you think the strongest moral argument is against saying, well, we blew them up, so now we have a responsibility to repair what we have done? And a lot of people follow that, and they'll try to put a guilt trip on somebody who says that this is not necessary.
Well, it's interesting. We read there was an interesting op-ed on RT today about the fact that the UK was very enthusiastically part of the bombing and absolute destruction of property, including a lot of private property in Libya. But now they've only coughed up £50,000, which probably wouldn't even fix up one house. And the argument of the writer, who I think is more of a left liberal humanitarian type, would be that they have a moral obligation to give more financial aid. But we were thinking about this more in the context of Congress's refusal to take responsibility for going to war, and I think the other side of that is refusal to take responsibility for the implications of blowing up a lot of people's private property overseas. And you made the point when I brought it up to you earlier before the show but that doesn't mean we did it. They steal our money to bomb them, and then they want to steal more to fix it up, and that certainly is a case. But I was wondering to you, and I'm still not sure about it. What is the obligation in a representative democracy if your representatives vote to blow up other people's private property?
Well, I'd ask him, where does he get this authority? Do two wrongs make a right? If they shouldn't have gone in there. But what I am concerned about is if 10 or 15 years ago we blew them up, then there's another generation and we have to tax the next generation. How is it fair to use government force to extract and further impoverish the current generation and create more inflation and the problems here at home? Because it doesn't seem fair, it seems immoral. So once you start using force to solve problems, you get into a lot of trouble, whether it's using force to have the government intervene from a liberal viewpoint on personal behavior, or the government gets involved to intervene in the economy for the benefit of the military-industrial complex or for other financial interests, or whether it's to help poor people. Once you get involved in doing this, there's no stopping of it. So I think you have to draw a much sharper line that they don't have the constitutional authority. I think we are very weak in pointing out they don't have the moral authority to use force to mold the world in the way they see it, and it costs a lot of money and it's very damaging. And we talk so much, and we've already talked about how the foreign policy backfires on us. You know, Libya, that's a great success. Oh, it's a great success in Iraq. I understand there are troops going back in Iraq, and Afghanistan is a haven. It's a mess. There's no argument that it does any good, costs a lot of money, and then they come up with this technicality and say, well, you have a moral obligation to repair what you've done. No, we have a moral obligation to get rid of these people in government who don't have the vaguest idea of what the Constitution says. And if war is thought to be necessary by our nation, even though you and I might disagree, technically, if the people put people in office and they have an up and down vote on war, that would restrain the Congress. But you've already mentioned that from our experience in Washington, they don't want the responsibility. They like this idea. I remember when the Democrats were, some of them voting against the war in Iraq because they said they didn't want a declaration of war because let the president make the decision. So that's both ways. It's responsibility, it's morality, it's who pays the bills, and none of it is good. And to me, the solution is not complex. Just defend people's liberties. And in a sense, you know, if you have a beef with a civil war going on, you should not be restrained by our government unless that civil war is literally attacking our country. That if you want to send your money or if you want to go over and do something, that should be your business. But that's not the case. It's the use of the iron fist of government to extract funds from us, inflate the currency, finance the military-industrial complex, and then they say, oh, okay, you've messed up. Your responsibility now is to rebuild. Well, that won't work because we're broke, so that's the way it's going to end.
Well, maybe the people who vote for the representatives who are in favor of the wars that destroy the private property should have a special tax that will help fix the property.
Well, they don't get the tax. The innocent people will end up getting it. A lot of people who might, have an instinct opposed to it. And there's not going to be a war tax, but there's going to be an inflation tax, and there's going to be a lost job as a consequence of the wrecked economy that they've given us. But I think some people say, yeah, that's fine and dandy, but maybe the in-between solution for this is not this humanitarian aid directly, and it's not the military, but if we just allot some money that is called foreign aid, just send them over a couple bucks, and like giving the money to the states and let the states take care of the problem and think that's going to solve it. But what's the shortcoming of the argument that foreign aid doesn't cost very much, 1%, that is the solution? I think there's a fallacy in that argument.
Yeah, it's you have to. Someone I saw this yesterday. I forget who wrote it, but you don't just count the checks or the food that we send over. You have to count all of the military bases, the expense of the U.S. empire, defending Japan, defending Europe. Then you start looking at foreign aid as a much higher percentage of your budget.
You know, whether it's humanitarian aid or military aid, I think the old saying about war is the health of the state, that's a pretty powerful statement. So if anybody is for statism, and it seems like we have a couple conservatives are for statism, and we have a few liberal progressive, they're for statism, that is power to the states, that they are the ones that, you know, sort of go along with the war. And most of the time they think, well, our guys are good guys, the other people are bad guys, and they don't approach us. But statism is bred by war. And it's not only, you know, the consequence of the direct war and the spending overseas of that consequence, but there's civil liberties that are involved too. Just think of the atmosphere of these last 15 years. I think we undid a few hundred years of the concept of individual liberty all the way back to the Magna Carta. I mean, some of the violations of the National Defense Authorization Act has done. This is horrible on our civil liberties. Back to torture. And candidates are still saying, well, it's okay to torture. I mean, what kind of civilization do we have? But they use force. So if we use force to mold people, what's the difference if we use force to deal with the problems we have created? And so one force adds to another.
And Besovich talked about this. You know, he said historically states will pass emergency measures in a time of wartime. The Constitution gets thrown aside. We think about the Japanese internment and many other things that happened. Certainly in World War I, the anti-war people were persecuted. But then there's a period of remorse afterward where they look back and say, oh, gosh, that was a dumb idea to put those Japanese in the camps and everything. But now it's almost we're in a state of permanent war that the remorse is so short-lived, it's like a tiny loop. The finding out the NSA has been spying on us. There was an uproar for a few months, and then they reformed it, and what's really did nothing but enshrine it in law, and now everyone's forgotten it, you know.
Yeah, and if they are reminded of it, they are going to be deceived by false information, and that's the conditioning that goes on. Because I have written about it, and I firmly believe it. People want peace. You know, they really do. People don't, and I imagine there's still even some who end up warmongering. They probably think limited war is okay, intimidate them a little bit. We'll use a little bit of force. They're not like, oh boy, let's see how much killing we do. I think it's their failed policies that, you know, expand and get them into more trouble. But not erasing authority, I think, and the bad stuff they do. Just think about how 15 years ago when they passed the authorization to use military force after 9/11 to deal with the people guilty about 9/11, I mean, they are still using that for Libya. I mean, they cite it anytime, any place. Oh yeah, uses military force, and there's no connection with 9/11 and ISIS. And yet they'll say, well, we got to go after ISIS because we have this authority here. The president had the decency to say, maybe you guys in Congress ought to rewrite it. But that's you know, un-Republican to suggest that the president actually made a constitutional request, and he may have other motivations, who know, but technically he's right. Why, if you really want us to do that, why don't you make it very clear? So he's not too worried about it, because I don't think he's against the UN giving him some cover and using NATO as a cover as well. So that's the way it's working these days.
And Besovich pointed out in his article that the 2001 authorization for military forces being used, as you point out, in places completely unrelated to 9/11. Yemen, for example, where the Saudis are conducting a genocidal war against the Yemenis. Somalia, where you have a nasty group that has no ambitions outside the confines of the country. Syria and Libya, as you say. But Congress does not want to go on record authorizing more force. You know, they don't even, and Besovich pointed out, McConnell refused, and these are his terms, they even refused to rubber stamp a Syria war that was already in effect. Obama said, hey, I've been bombing Syria for a while. You want to give me some authorization or what? And he said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to tie the next president's hands.
You know, there's one other fact that's been floating around, not a fact, but a belief that people look to justify war in desperate times. You know, when the economy is bad and you're in depression, there's still a lot of people who actually believe that a war will be good for the economy. And how that can be the case, I don't know. You run up debt, you spend money, you take more money from the poor. I remember World War II, and it was not a prosperous time. And they do this and argue that, no, it's good for jobs. Yes, everybody's drafted and they get shot at, and a bunch of them get killed. It's not good, and it has to be paid for. But people still are doing that. You'll hear it in the news now. Yep. You know, we got out of the Depression by the World War II, which is baloney, because the economy never started growing again. The debt was liquidated during that period of time. It never started growing until after World War II. But there are people advocating this and think it's good for the economy. But they'd also argue and think, well, if that's the case, we should be booming. Now look how much money the military-industrial complex gets in.
They're booming.
And
yeah.
The only, and I've mentioned this before, the only so-called compromise, if we could dilute some of this money and delete some of this money going to the military-industrial complex, as long as it's enough to lower the deficit, this money could be better used as a transition from the people we taught for generations to be totally dependent on government, because it's pretty hard to have a transition, say, okay, tomorrow the Fed gets closed down, we close this down, and the poor people have to go on their own medical care. But the thing that they don't understand, if we don't do something and have a transition, that is exactly what's going to happen to them. There will be an economic calamity. And this is what we should be dealing with, concern for the overall cost. And it's very expensive whether you have a humanitarian instinct or whether you have a war instinct. Nothing good can come about it because it's all endorsed by force. And every time there is an action, economic or attack on personal liberties or a foreign intervention, it creates new problems. And that's why we keep going back. And this has been around for a long time, but it's especially bad in the last 10 to 15 years. And that's why, you know, the war that we literally started in 2003 or extended. We had started it actually sooner than that. And now we're back into those countries. And the countries have been devastated. Libya is a mess. And yet, what is so frustrating to me is serious debate and discussion on foreign policy. You don't hear about it in the presidential debates. They're not talking about that. It's talking about people's wives and different things like that. It is so far removed from talking about the serious matters. So until that happens, don't expect the election of 2016 to change very much. The parties are the same basically, but it is exciting to see people on a personal basis fighting and fuming and personalizing the whole thing. But I think the issue of liberty is very important. The issue of non-intervention and striving for peace and prosperity is a worthy cause. I do want to thank everybody today for tuning in to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.